Okay, I'd like to call the meeting to order, please. We do have quorum. I would like to welcome everybody to the third meeting of the Budget Committee. I'm going to just have everybody quieten down a little bit so we can begin. Perfect. This is the third meeting of the Budget Committee. It is the first of two wrap-up meetings where we're going to be wrapping up the budget, the Budget Committee recommendations that will be going off to executive and then from there to full council in a couple of weeks. Again, this is the first meeting of two wrap-ups, and for those who have seen the process, I'll discuss it just in a couple of minutes on that, but the goal again is, as I said, to finish the recommendations for the budget for next week. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And we also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And of course, you can watch us on YouTube at Toronto City Council Live, or go on to toronto.ca/council. Any declarations of conflict? Councillor Layton.
Yes, thank you very much. I need to declare a conflict on the water budget, the portion specifically that pertains to a grant for service to an organization that administers the Blue Flag Program for Sustainable Beaches, as my spouse currently works for them.
Perfect, thank you. The committee and councillors, we have before us 5 items. BU 3.1 Toronto Water, BU 3.2 the Solid Waste Management Services, BU 3.3 Toronto Parking Authority, BU 3.4 the 2019 capital and operating budgets, and BU 3.5 additional City of Toronto reporting requirement as a result of Ontario Regulation 286/09 budget matters and expenses. I'm going to be holding all of these items. So I'm just going to kind of go through what to expect. So I'm going to propose that we begin at the top of the order and work our way through the rate-supported budgets, and then from there we'll go on to the tax-supported budgets. So for each item, Josie Levita, the Executive Director of Financial Planning Division, is going to present. If you have been part of the process in previous years, it is we go through what we call the blue and green sheets. Josie does an exceptional job at moving us through very efficiently. So we'll ask questions of all these supplementary reports, all of the briefing notes, and then we'll ask questions overall on any of the agencies, the divisions, and all the different sections, community social services, infrastructure development. So there'll be an opportunity to ask overall questions. And then there will be an opportunity to, you can move motions today if you choose, but we won't be voting on any motions. That'll be held over till next week. I want to remind you that if you have any motions with regard to briefing notes, please submit them to the clerk in writing as soon as possible. And with your permission, sharing them with myself and the Executive Director of Financial Planning, as we did last week, so we could review them. We will be voting on any more briefing note requests today. And hopefully they will be ready for next week's final wrap-up, which is on February 20th. Any questions at all on the process? It should be fairly straightforward once we begin. On that, I will pass it over to Josie Levita to run us through the morning.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So what you have before you are 2 sets of green documents and 2 sets of blue. Blue represents capital matters and the green represents our operating budget matters. We're going to go through the rate budgets first. So the blue and green sheets that have in the top right-hand corner, BU 0.31, 3.2, and 3.3 address the Toronto Water, the Solid Waste, and the Toronto Parking Authority budgets. Okay? The other thing that is also before you, and they were sent out last night, would have been the subsequent briefing notes that were requested at the last meeting. Just to recap, there was a group that was issued February 4th. They were briefing notes numbers 1 to 10. And then as a result of the requests made at the last meeting, we have briefing notes number 11 to 36, which would have been issued late yesterday, and I believe packages are here for you. Okay? All right, so I'm going to start with capital, rate-supported budget, blue sheets. And if we follow along, I'll navigate you through this. So we're on page 2. And we had 2 briefing notes, excuse me, that were issued back in February 4th. These are standard briefing notes that are provided by our Toronto Water staff. These have been requests in the past that outline the basement flooding protection program and provides a status update. That's briefing note number 8. And briefing note number 9 actually provides the list of projects that are planned in the 10-year capital plan for the first 5 years of the program. So these are here before you. If you have any questions of the general manager, now would be the time.
Questions on these 2 items? Councillor. Number 8 and number 9.
Page 8 and page 9. For those of you who are page 2, if you page. Right, so we're looking at the blue sheets that has BU1, BU 3.1, 3.2, 3.3. That's the rate. For those of you that have your laptops, if you have the wrap-up notes online, they actually have, you can click on the left-hand column and go right into the briefing note, the report, or whatever is before you, so that's available as well.
Still have questions, Councillor Layton, or just?
I do, but again,
yeah.
Given some of this was delivered this morning, they're in 2 different packages.
Yep.
They don't have tabs. It's going to take a second to find.
No, I understand that.
So through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor, the package that we would have received previously, the yellow package, would have had the briefing notes 8 and 9 in it.
Yeah.
Keep up to speed. And again, I don't know what we do otherwise because it's nice to get material in advance. And I know that we're asking for these briefing notes
Yeah.
in like 4 days turnaround. So I get it's just frustrating
Yeah.
all around.
Yeah. No, and I respect, there is a challenge. The first package were ones that can get done quickly, and again, because of the volume of some of them, it's hard to get them in.
Last year for me.
So if it would be helpful, potentially, maybe the general manager just could outline what's in those 2 briefing notes, if that, to get you, okay. Sure.
Through you, Mr. Chair. I could give you an outline of the 2 basement flooding briefing notes. The first one deals with the program status update. If we take a look at that briefing note, we issue that annually just to give you an update of where we're at with the completion of EAs. What I would note of difference this year than you've seen in subsequent years is that we've put out a very large request for proposals to start all of the remaining environmental assessments this year. So that document is out on the market right now to be tendered on. And so that's why you see on page 2 of that briefing note all the remaining basement flooding study areas starting with a start date of 2019. Our objective is to try to accelerate the completion of the environmental assessments for all those areas. We wanted to get at least the studies completed so we can begin the construction programming for those wards. So that's something that's different, and the cash flow has been accounted for in our budget. If you go on page 4, you will see a breakdown of properties receiving subsidies for the flood protection devices. Those are the individual subsidies that homeowners can apply for. We've given you a breakdown per ward. So that's the first briefing note, essentially highlighting the acceleration of the environmental assessment studies. The second briefing note, the lengthier one, is our annual update on the project lists for the next 5 years, the 2019 to 2023 capital plan as identified in our total capital plan that's submitted. We've extracted out the basement flooding projects just to show clarity for councillors. They could see which projects are to be constructed in 2019, and we have the breakdown by ward and by street name, and into year 2, year 3 as well. We also keep in this briefing note the running tally of projects that exceeded the $32,000 per benefiting household cap, and we show that list as well. So that's on the briefing note. As a companion, we've given you updated maps now reflecting the new 25 ward boundary, showing the work that has been completed ward by ward for environmental studies, construction activity, and basement flooding subsidies. So that's the dashboards, the annual dashboards we provide as well. So that's the summaries of the 2 briefing notes.
Has the priority list changed at all because of more recent flooding events?
Through you, Mr. Chair. No, not within the immediate year, within year 1 and 2. Where the storm occurred this past August, it actually hit parts of the city that had already been identified as having problems with basement flooding. So it was just another event for homeowners that have experienced excessive flooding in the past. So we are, in those particular wards, already doing construction, in some cases completed construction, and in other areas just in the cusp of completing EAs.
Are you able to identify if any of the ravine work that needs to be done around the major water courses as it pertains to Toronto Water, is that included in the state of good repair? Because there's hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps more, in those that need to be done to the water courses and ravines. Is that included in the state of good repair?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, it is, not in the basement flooding program.
Yeah.
Within Toronto Water's capital program, we do have a couple of other line items. We have line items to deal with stream erosion that impacts Toronto Water infrastructure in particular. And then we have another line item where we provide monies to the Toronto Region Conservation Authority for them to deal with other critical erosion sites. We've got, I believe, earmarked about $140 million to the TRCA over the next 10 years, dealing with the most critical locations. There are other locations that have been identified that haven't hit that critical or priority level and remain unfunded.
That remain unfunded?
That's correct.
Do you have a list of those projects?
We would have a list jointly between us and the TRCA.
Is that list available?
We could get it as a separate list. It's not included in our notes. It's used by staff right now. The Toronto Region Conservation Authority has a methodology on ranking the criticality of erosion sites, and we use that as the basis of funding. We'll take the most critical, and that could change based on storm events. They will reprioritize that list, but we don't fund the entire list, because some on that list are state of good repair or need to get to, but it's not critical yet. Because when you add that up, you're into the hundreds of millions of dollars to deal with all erosion sites across the city.
But that's not included in your current state of good repair?
No, we've got just the critical. We've just got the critical locations identified in here.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Councillor McKelvey.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chair. Along the same lens, in the TRCA report, it looked like they had a line item for the ravine strategy and would be reporting back later this year on prioritization and implementation of that program. Is that correct? And is that on track?
Through you, I will throw to the General Manager, Parks, Forestry, Recreation to get into specifics, but we work closely with TRCA, Toronto Water, and Parks because there's joint stewardship in those ravines. So Janie, if you could give an update.
So through the chair, that's correct. We're working on the implementation strategy for the ravine strategy, which will come back for consideration in the 2020 budget. It will have a look at the items within the water budget, the transportation budget, the TRCA budget, and the Parks, Forestry, and Recreation budget around various priority sites within the ravine system and identify the existing funding for them, the prioritization order for them, as well as a number of unfunded areas that we'll need to look at in future years.
So will that report recommend what the funding needs need to be for how many years out will that look at?
It's a 20-year strategy.
A 20-year strategy? And as part of that, then, is it also to kind of create an umbrella? Because it sounds like, you know, the question is getting pushed between departments. So will this kind of create like an umbrella strategy that kind of better integrates and streamlines
Through the
all
chair,
the
that's
different things happening in our ravines?
That's exactly correct. The idea around the strategy, and we actually have an interdivisional capital coordinating committee working right now on looking at all of the capital budgets associated with the ravines between all of those divisions, with the idea of prioritizing a joint prioritization framework so that funds can be used together and capitalized as much as possible in a single project that's going on. So as an example, we all don't go back at various times to do different things.
And so by streamlining that process and better interweaving all these different departments working in ravines, is there thought to be a cost dollar savings and efficiencies that could then be actually turned around to remediation and erosion control and all those sorts of good things we need?
Through the chair, that's exactly correct. The hope is that through this coordination of the budget, we'll be able to better resource the priorities that we have.
And so in addition to reporting back on what the needs are financially for this 20-year ravine strategy, will you have a line item that says what that cost savings has been? Will you also put a dollar value on that to show how this has created efficiencies in the system?
Through the chair, we can certainly have a look at that.
Okay, that would be fantastic.
And look at, you know, the different phasing and what we've achieved through coordinating these projects in a more streamlined process.
I look forward to the report. Thank you.
Any other questions? Just want to remind councillors that when we're going through, we'll have plenty of opportunity to ask questions on overall different divisions, but again, these were briefing notes just on the basement flooding. We tended to move on to talking a bit about ravine strategy, so I'm going to try to push us into just focusing on this. We'll, yeah, somewhere. But anyway, I just wanted to just acknowledge that we're trying to just focus on the briefing notes, and we'll have plenty of questions as we move forward to sort of get them all answered. So, okay, Josie, next.
All right, so through you, Mr. Chair, so those were the only two capital-related briefing notes for our rate programs. The bottom of page 2, there were no motions that were placed at the last meeting. So then really what's left in this document are the reports for consideration, which are essentially the recommendations in the budget notes as we move forward for final wrap-up for Toronto Water on page 3. And I think the point to note there is for 2019, we're looking at $960 million of funding to continue with that program. And then it sets out the 10-year capital plan recommendations on page 5 for solid waste management. The 2019 budget in recommendation 4 is 19 cash flow of $84.6 million. And then there are the 10-year capital plan estimates at the bottom. And then finally, as we turn the page, we do have one report relating to the parking authority before we deal with their capital. So the bike share program on page 6. So we have a report before us, it's 3.3A. There are operating recommendations and capital recommendations. What we have done here is isolated the capital related recommendations as part of the report. So what we need to get is authorization here to deal with outstanding 2016 capital requirements and have that funded, and also look at funding the 19 program from Section 37 and 45 funds. There are other recommendations as it relates to the operating side of bike share that we'll deal with in a moment. So that report's before you and for your consideration at our next meeting. And then finally on page 7, the Toronto Parking Authority capital budget and plan for 2019 at $68.4 million. And that's it. Mr. Chair, for our rate capital.
Council, so what I'm going to suggest is to work through, I'll do Toronto Water, Solid Waste, and Parking Authority questions. Does that work out for everybody on capital?
Sure.
Okay.
I just want to know, the letter report, I know where the briefing notes are, but where's this bike share letter report with recommendations? That I haven't seen. Where's this 3.3A letter report?
So through you, Mr. Chair, it would have been part of the agenda sent out by the clerk, but
Oh, okay, so I'll find it in the agenda. I was just looking for it on the budget page. Does it appear on the budget page if people want to look for it there?
through you, Mr. Chair, I don't believe that part's linked, but if you are online with the wrap-up notes and you click on 3.3, it'll take you right to the report.
Okay, and can we, because that is such a point of interest for a specific group of residents, can we make sure that it does make its way to the budget page? The end goal being, by the time we adopt the budget in 2019, anything you'd ever want to know about the budget in 2019 is on the page we set aside for it. Is that possible?
Yes, so through you, Mr. Chair, absolutely.
Cool. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so what am any on 3.1 Toronto Water Capital? Any questions? That's page 3, by the way, of the blue.
Sure. Just to continue on the previous question, why don't those other capital projects show up in the state of good repair? The ones that aren't prioritized as critical, but we know we'll have to do at some point.
Through you, Mr. Chair, what we do is we sit down with the Toronto Region Conservation Authority and we identify those projects that are on their list, and they keep a running list, as does Toronto Water. So there's two lists. One that the city has to fund 100%, others that we have to assess whether they get a contribution from Toronto Water or do they get some from property tax. How it's funded is split sometimes, because it could be just a private property matter. And so what TRCA does, because they identify the long list, and it includes issues such as Gibraltar Point and Bluffers Park. So those are very, very large projects that require tens of millions of dollars, if not several hundreds of millions of dollars to address. So if you funded their entire list, you would have to look at big increases to water rates and property taxes potentially to fund the entire list. So the way we've been doing it for many years is dealing with the most critical and critical sites first and keeping an eye on those other locations. And as well, what the TRCA has is their annual allocation for state of good repair funding, which is a more conservative amount, it's a base amount, of which they get around to dealing with state of good repair projects. What we've done in the city over the last few years is giving them a top-up over the base amount that we funded for their state of good repair funding on erosion control. We've given them a special account for the critical ones. So we've augmented that funding for at least 5, 6, 7 years and continuing for the next 10 years. So we've done both.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions on capital water? Councillor Carroll, looks like you have your hand half up. No, it's on that. Okay, so we'll get to that. Next will be solid waste capital. Seeing no questions, now we will go on to capital Parking Authority. Councillor Carroll, I believe this would be the bike share one.
Well, just a quick question. We saw in this year's notes that I see Parking Authority did just walk in. There are some Parking Authority people here. We saw that bike share is on a certain footing now. I'm just wondering about, we're also adopting in this letter some financial principles that they're financial principles, but in a way they're service levels if these principles do not work out. It talks about commitment to municipal funding subsidies, but then I read the next recommendation, which is C4. Subsidy funding would not rely on property tax sources, debt financing, or impact operating budgets. So I'm just wondering, are we safe adopting that today? That if we were in a situation where bike share was struggling and that was needed, that a recommendation could come to budget? If we adopt this today, would we be able to override this statement if it was necessary to keep the program afloat? Who will be answering that question?
I could try.
Through the chair.
Yeah.
My assumption would be that on an annual basis, we would be reporting back the results of bike share. And from time to time,
Yeah, I think it just needs volume. Yeah.
is that all right?
Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
My assumption is that we would be reporting annually through this process, and from time to time, the Budget Committee and Council would be making decisions as to whether the funding arrangement would remain. Our position is that bike share represents the last mile of transport and is an integral part to the movement and choices of those in the city, looking to move as quickly and efficiently and cheaply for them as possible.
So while we're going to adopt this statement today, all those other principles of how we're growing the system can go on. While we're adopting this, that doesn't preclude if it ran into problems, or if you wanted to propose a certain expansion, you could, or your board could come to council and say, this is your principle, however, if. That would still be in order?
I believe so.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Layton?
Yes, the budget notes identify, and I couldn't find the letter, but identify in 2019 some monies from section 37 and 45. Are those accounts identified in the letter itself?
Yes, as part of the budget process, we've gone through and tied out each ward in each area.
Is it possible, like, I'm just saying for me, but I'm sure some other colleagues, if you could reach out independently and just about write the motion for us to release those funds as part of this, so we're not doing it later on, that would be helpful. I know there's section 37 and 45 within Ward 11 going towards already dedicated to bike share, and I'm happy to move those. But given that we're going to be delving into bigger, deeper budget items, we might miss that. So if you could, I would reach out to the local councillors with the language that they need to put forward to allocate those funds within their wards directly to bike share, just so it's done at the beginning of the year. That would be really helpful.
I believe it's a part of the budget notes, but we'll make sure that that's available.
Right.
Yeah.
So through you, Mr. Chair, it's already part of the budget. We've identified the accounts. It's actually in the capital.
And they're already being, because that's not always the case with some with some 37
Right.
allotments.
This has been part of the budget process, so
Okay.
we've secured, we've assured, it's
We're
appropriate.
not going to have to do this 6 months from now.
We're good.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you, Council. Any other questions? Okay, I think we're done the capital now. We can go into operating.
Okay, so we're done with the capital, and that will all be referred to the final wrap-up, and the briefing notes can be received for information. So now turning to the green sheets, it's page 1 of 21. Again, it's BU 3.1, 3.2, and 3.3. As we move forward onto page 2, we're showing you the potential financial impact related to one of the motions that's before us. And that motion, when we get to it, represents a change in the industrial waste surcharge formula that would be applied to all treatable parameters that would have a revenue loss of $2.6 million. Okay, so on page 3, we'll start with briefing notes. There was a request for a briefing note. It's briefing note number 29 to the general manager. providing information on the list of the businesses charged under the Industrial Water Surcharge Program, and the parameters that they are exceeding to receive the surcharge, and then a recommendation to move to the Industrial Waste Surcharge Program towards full cost recovery. So that briefing note is before you, and it outlines the companies that exceed the wastewater sanitary concentration limits, and it provides a list of those companies in particular, and also outlines the annual adjustment factors that would be required to achieve full cost recovery. And then finally, if you turn the page, it says that if you use the 6-year phase-in approach that would gradually adjust the surcharge fees, that would allow companies sufficient time to address process changes, but that there would be a change in the revenue of $204,000.
Questions? Councillor Layton, I'm assuming? Are you?
Make any assumption. Yes.
What is your brief note request?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. The list of companies, in past years, there's been more companies that just have one surcharge parameter that's being released. Have they been left off this list, or there were much more companies just releasing one?
Through you, Mr. Chair, if you look on page 3 of the briefing note,
Yeah.
there's a listing of 370 companies that have active industrial waste surcharge agreements with us, and at this present time, 359 of those companies have multiple parameters. So there is a much smaller percentage now that have only one parameter. Now we have lost some industries along the way too, so there is a lesser number of industrial waste surcharge agreements than in prior years as well.
And it looks like there may be a couple companies that are I don't want to say greater offenders, that's not what they are, but have a greater, likely a greater subsidy than the majority of the list.
It's through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, there's great variability amongst the various companies. They vary between size, flow, the concentration, the number of parameters that are impacted. So when we look at the individual impacts, the range is significant. So you may have a medium-sized company that has some multiple parameters with some higher strength discharges that we can treat at our plant. They could be impacted significantly by this change, while in other cases you may have a company who may have multiple parameters, but with respect to the highest parameter, it may be, for example, BOD being the largest one that they are paying for. The other parameters may be just very small amounts, and so the impact may not be that great. So it is very industry-specific, company-specific, and it's hard for us to predict. That's why we provided a range in table 3 on page 4, just trying to give you an indication of how variable it is.
In the bands, is there an idea of what the actual cost increase? Oh, it's in table 3 about what the annual cost increase would be to those companies. That's
right. We've given you an example of the high and the low between 4 categories of company type, and then as well below it, we've given you the average. And the reason we did that is because the range, as you can see, can be quite significant in some of those categories.
And just those are the total implications, or the first year? Those are the total.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that would be the total.
Yeah. And just finally, do all these companies qualify for a Block 2 rate already?
Mr. Chair, no. The Block 2 rate is specific to large water users. We've got generally around 100 companies, usually 90 to 100 companies that are on that program. So it would only be a small portion of this group.
Okay. And typically the higher volume users?
In order to get the Block 2 rate, you have to be a manufacturer, and you also have to consume greater than 5,000 cubic meters a year. So you have to be a large water user.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor McKelvey.
I realize all the companies are different, but in general, do you think that if you were to switch to this type of rate-based program, that there would be incentives for them to decrease their contaminant loads or to change their treatment parameters? Like, is it possible for them to have savings going forward if we were to go?
Through you, Mr. Chair, with respect to the cost to implement pre-treatment or treatment at site, it would vary from company to company and could be difficult for some of the smaller and medium-sized companies to make that kind of capital investment. For the larger companies, some of them have already migrated to pre-treatment, and that's why we no longer have industrial waste surcharge agreements with them. It made economic sense for them to look at putting in some pre-treatment as opposed to paying the city to treat that overstrength. For some of the smaller companies, they might not be able to raise the capital to do that, and that's why we have this program, because our treatment plants can effectively treat this overstrength waste. It's BODs, it's suspended solids. That's what our treatment plants are designed to do, is treat that kind of load. And so the program we offer is economical in that we already have the infrastructure. We're just charging more because it exceeds the maximum allowable concentration limits. So we do charge a little bit more for that.
And so you mentioned specifically BOD or total dissolved solids. What about things like, nitrogen, phosphorus, like the nutrient load? Because there's no free lunch. Like, we're not really removing them from the stream. We may be moving it into a sludge. So what is happening on that front?
So with respect to, so we do have 5 treatable parameters. So phosphorus is one of them we can treat. There is a cost for treating that. We have to add chemicals to precipitate out the phosphorus. It typically ends up in our solids train. Right. At some of our plants, we actually use that biosolids, as we call it, and we turn it into pellets. We put it on fields. So the phosphorus is a nutrient, and it gets used that way. And in another facility, we continue to incinerate it. With respect to anything that we can't treat, well then, no, they have to comply with the bylaw. The only reason we have these 5 parameters is because our treatment plants are designed to treat that. They're just sending us something that's stronger than the maximum allowable in the bylaw. So they pay a surcharge over and above their normal base rate. So it makes economic sense for us to treat it. And as long as they're paying that cost for treatment, the program is sustainable.
You mentioned the smaller companies maybe wouldn't have the ability to implement changes. Are there grants and different programs that are available to them so that they could upgrade their facilities so that they be able to save in the future on these parameters?
Through you, Mr. Chair, not through Toronto Water. Sometimes there are other programs through federal and provincial programs that deal with manufacturers. Those are the ones that typically would struggle. I'm thinking of, in Toronto in particular, we have a lot of food processors that are smaller in nature that do have overstrength agreements with us. You could see on the list. Those are the ones I think that would be challenged sometimes to make an investment of a few $100,000 for pretreatment. But we in Toronto Water do not subsidize technologies.
And is what we're doing best practice? Is this what other municipalities do? How do we compare?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes. We've study that we did back in 2011 and 12, which we presented to committee, documented the best practices across Canada and North America, and the program that we put forward is a best practice.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, oh, sorry. Councillor Nunziata.
Yeah, just a question. So with some of the list of the businesses that you have here, how many of them do you know are operating 24/7?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I wouldn't know.
You wouldn't know that?
Yeah, if you look at the list too, we have a mix of businesses, but we also have condominiums. So some condominium corporations have agreements with us as well, because they do have some retail component potentially in them. So I don't know when they're operating.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Josie?
Okay, so we're now on page 4. Briefing note number 30 was the second request of the General Manager, Toronto Water, asking for information that examines the options of modifying the Block 2 rate, looking at the benefits and the implications of a discount ranging from 1% to 5%. So that's before you. It's called water rate structuring. And options have been provided, and what it's showing is if it were a 1% discount, it's $7.7 million over 10 years. 5% phased in over 2 years would be a almost $3 million impact, and a 5% block rate reduction in 1 year, $38.6 million. So if that were to proceed, the briefing note says that this would have to be absorbed by other ratepayers, or a reduction in the capital financing contribution with a corresponding reduction in the 10-year capital plan expenditures.
Councillor Layton.
Just to that last point that Josie said, would you recommend a reduction in $30 million to our capital budget allocation?
Through you, Mr. Chair, my advice to committee, if it so chooses to proceed with this, would be to make up that revenue loss by adjusting the
Rates
Block
for
1
other
rate.
users.
Otherwise, you may have to go in and modify the 10-year capital program to deal with the fact that the reserve essentially would bottom out to close to $5 million in 1 year, which is practically nothing compared to the asset base in Toronto Water.
What does a $40 million annual increase look like to other water users?
We did provide that in the briefing note. So if you take a look at the way we set up the briefing note, the table, when you see the A component, when we show on the top line the additional increase to Block 1, for example, on option 1 would be a 0.058% increase to the Block 1 rate for each percentage point drop. So if you looked at option 2, which would be a 1-year implementation of a 5% change to the discount factor, you would have to increase the Block 1 rate by 0.3%. So on top of the requested rate increase right now, you'd have to add another 0.3.
Yeah, and the rate increase was what this year?
The rate increase, the annual revenue increase is 3%. The effective rate would go up 3.9, so you'd add the 0.3, so it'd be about 4.2.
Do you recognize this report? It's a Watson and Associates City of Toronto Competitiveness User Rates Municipal Study. Did you commission this report?
Yes, we work jointly with our colleagues in economic development. And Toronto Water commissioned that report, where we presented it to committee, I believe, a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago.
Now, would you say, you just in a previous line of questioning said that those that qualify for Block 2 rates are typical large manufacturers, correct?
That's correct. To qualify, you must be large user.
Figure 4-16 was the total annual service cost for large industrial manufacturers in the Watson report. Do you remember what that chart probably showed?
I don't remember that specific one. I do remember in general the conclusion is that there are quite a number of cost factors for a manufacturer within the city, and that water was not really the major determinant of whether an industry stayed or not, even if it was a large water user. It was a lower cost input to manufacturing.
And for large manufacturers in particular, where did Toronto rank in the total cost, not just water, but the total cost of operating compared to other major U.S. and Canadian cities?
I would say close to the lower end of the range.
Close to the lower end, or the second lowest that we studied of the roughly 18
pretty close to the lower end, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Carroll, did you have a question?
Oh, just to put a fine point on it. The only other question that Councillor Layton didn't ask, this group of users got a rate adjustment providing certain protection during the period of time that residential users paid increases of 9% a year over 9 years, 9 every year for 9 years. Did we do a block adjustment for this group of users during that period?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes. When we restructured the water rate, we brought report forward in 2007. We had a former 7-block tiered system, an inverted U, as they called it in the industry. We recommended going to 1 block with a second block discounted for large water users, and we phased in that transition. We started with a 20% discount factor, and each year we held back the increases to only 1/3 of the residential and all other user increases until the gap spread to became 30%, and then they rose at the same rate as all other users.
Right, so we did all that for them, got rid of any flat rate areas in the city for residential users, raised residential users 9% a year every year for 9 years, and then stepped down to 3. We had some 5% years. So we've done a big adjustment to residential to make them, fairly charged in comparison to other GTA municipalities and other major cities in the province. We also have now made the rate for this block of users competitive in those same areas, if they were to locate in the GTA or other major municipalities in Ontario.
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, when we compare the Block 2 rate, it remains competitive with other GTA municipalities, with a few anomalies in Southern Ontario where some municipalities have been very aggressive giving a greater discount to large water users. But for the most part, we're in that lower band of being competitive.
We're in the lower band, and all of that is even if we disregard and receive this motion.
All those previous programs have achieved what we wanted them to do, and that's to keep the water rate to be affordable for large water users. We do look at affordability every year. We present that information to this committee as we compare our rates to other jurisdictions.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Next, Joseph.
Okay, so that concludes any briefing note requests for Toronto Water. There were none for solid waste management services, but on page 5, we have one, it's briefing note number 11 for the Toronto Parking Authority. That was a request to explain the differences in the services and rent numbers from 2018 to 2019. So that's been provided, and essentially it's a recategorization between 2 categories of expense of the municipal taxes paid to the city.
Questions on that briefing note? Okay, Josie, next.
To page 6, second briefing note requested of the Parking Authority. It's briefing note number 12. 2 parts to that. The first was a request that in consultation with the General Manager of Transportation, provide information on the metrics of the discounts given as part of the King Street pilot and whether these incentives continue to be necessary. And secondly, that the General Manager of Transportation, Chief Planner, bring data to assist City Council with reviewing whether Toronto Parking Authority discounts are still necessary. So we have before you the one on King Street transit pilot discounts. What it identifies is that a discount was offered in 2018, had a cost of $509,500 with almost 79,000 uses. The assumption is that if it were to be extended for a 6-month period into 2019, that would have a revenue loss of about $300,000. And there is work being done to evaluate the pilot and with the data to be collected, and that will be coming back to look at those considerations for the future.
Questions? Looks like we're good.
All right, so turning to page 7, we now have motions that are before us regarding these 3 groups. So the first one was placed at our last meeting, and that will be referred to the final wrap-up, which is consideration being given to approving an industrial waste surcharge. That would then be moving forward to the final wrap-up. Again, if this were to be recommended to go forward, That would have a $204,000 revenue impact over the 6-year period if that were phased in. The next one on that page is a referral from the 2018 operating budget process. Excuse me. So excuse me. All right. So for those of you that may recall last year, there was a council approved a draw from the tree canopy reserve for a particular purpose, and at the same time then asked the general manager Toronto Water to consider for 2019 whether funds should be brought forward from Toronto Water to replenish the tree canopy reserve by $3 million, and that it be used towards tree planting and maintenance. And that it be used towards front lawn and boulevard sod repair and replacement. So the disposition of that for 2019 is that there is no contribution from Toronto Water to this reserve, because this type of work actually is currently being performed by Toronto Water as part of their capital projects, and so there would be no need to replenish it for that purpose.
Questions?
Yes, just on that recommendation from council in February last year, and this will be, I guess, to Parks or to whoever could answer it. Was that a staff recommendation in February, or was it a council?
So I'll start. The recommendation, this particular recommendation came from council. The original recommendation to draw from that reserve in the first place also came from council.
And what was the purpose of the draw from the reserves? Was that the cleanup from, oh, please, you got a smile on now, Josie. What was the purpose of that reserve draw?
The smile is I'm trying to recall, but I believe
Okay.
it was actually a $3.5 million draw, if the general manager of Parks, Forestry and Recreation can recall, and this was funds going towards the Menser, is it the Mensner project in TRCA?
Through the chair, apologies, but I missed the beginning of the question.
The on page 7, it talks about a council request to replenish the tree canopy reserve of $3 million that was withdrawn last year. I'm just wondering what that withdrawal was for.
If my memory serves me correctly, and I would have to go back and check everything, but there was a request to replenish the tree canopy reserve if the year-end position allowed us to do so? No? Josie is saying no.
No, well, I'm curious what the draw of $3.5 million out of the reserve, tree canopy reserve was for.
The draw from the reserve, if my recollection is correct, I'm looking for Josie's nod yes as we're going, that it was a $3.5 million draw that supported the tree program, the forestry program?
Through you, Mr. Chair, if I could jump in, as I do recall this debate from a former councillor. And so the issue was about topping up the contribution that Toronto Water already makes to tree canopy, which is about $2 million a year. So we fund that every year and have so for a greater part of more than a decade now. And so there was a one-time draw to bump up the parks reserve, that was $3 million, along with a recommendation that we look at adding $5 million a year to top it up even more. The premise being that we should replace trees that we damaged during construction. We do that already. When we do construction work, whether it's completed by ECS, or Engineering Construction Group, or Toronto Water, we put in that budget the replacement of trees. We work with forestry and have a plan that reinstates it, and it's embedded already in our capital. So what we saw this as being redundant need.
Sure. But I'm still a little confused about what the original draw from the reserves.
It was just to top up the reserve, to put more money into the reserve.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'll try one last time. So there
I'm
was
going to try after Josie, because I remember now.
Yes.
I'll give a swing at this.
Yeah, there's a recommendation that was made last year during the budget process to draw $3.5 million out and to contribute those funds to the Menno Resner project, which is under, I believe, the TRCA's authority. Then the request was to see if Toronto Water could replenish up to 3 million of it.
So what's the Menno-Resner project?
It's a project under the TRCA that looked at restoring some, doing work on the okay. It's rehabilitation maintenance work being done at around the Toronto Wildlife Centre location.
I think I know which city councillor made this motion.
Oh,
Oh, why did we give that councillor such a long leash?
Councillor Carroll.
Okay. The penny just dropped with a big thud, but just to put a point on this for the new councillors, the purpose stated here in the motion is the key to the redundancy here. Built into the project costs of each project is the cost of restoring front lawns and boulevards and replacing trees if they're not protected.
Through Mr. Chair, that's correct. If we damage any trees in the roadway, we will replace them. And in fact, if we're doing large projects, we work very closely with our colleagues in forestry to have a planting plan behind it. I could think of some water ponds that we built where we did take down some trees and we replanted double the amount behind it. So we work out.
Right, because you're subject to the same rules as any developer or private contractor, et cetera, where it comes to tree protection. Am I right?
The same rules, and if not enhanced, because we already contribute $2 million a year on the budget on top of the capital. So we have allocations within our specific capital projects, and then on top of it, there's a separate line item, $2 million a year for just general tree replacement. And so we work closely with the director on how best to use those monies.
So currently, even if we don't pass this motion, you don't expect to run out of funds to complete these responsibilities?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, not at all. We make sure that we provide adequate funding to deal with their tree canopy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I think we're next.
okay, I hope that was enlightening. Next item, page 7, solid waste management services. So City Council at its meeting on January 30th adopted a motion directing the General Manager of Solid Waste to provide each City Councilor the opportunity to host second Community Environment Day, undertake the administrative process of booking one additional one, and preparation for the 19th season, pending the outcome of the 2019 budget process. So that's before you as a motion. What is currently in the Solid Waste Management Services budget is $605,000 for one Community Environment Day in each ward. And I understand that some work is being done to look at the administrative process to how that could be supported, and the GM's here to speak to any questions that you might have.
Councillor Carroll.
Well, so just a quick question. Between when this motion was moved and now, has there been any surveying of councillors' offices to try and get a handle on how we would cost this? Because if it's at the request of the councillor, we're going to have to estimate what the addition to the budget would be.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor, we sent out a notice last week to the councillor supports office to identify any additional E-Day requests. We're still going through those right now, and we'll be able to update with the requested briefing note next week.
Oh, so by the time we're in final wrap-up, we would have some idea of what the additional cost would be and whether or not you would be able to absorb it within the rate announced?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Elvey.
What was the amount spent on this in 2018?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor, I believe it was around $900,000. That was the budget. I'll just have to double check with my team here on the exact cost of the entire program.
And then, so this 605 is additional, so what is the total cost for 2019 if everybody gets two?
So through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor, the total budget for this year is anticipated to be $600,000 total. So not an additional to that 900,000.
But that includes, so, oh, sorry, okay, I want to make sure I'm clear on that. So it was 900 last year, now you're thinking total it's 605, and that includes if councillors still have two?
No. So through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor, the $600,000 would be for one per ward. We're currently reviewing our practices and our job duties and staffing requirements for E-days to see if we can accomplish an additional E-day per ward within that allotted $600,000. That will be brought forward if a briefing note is approved by council to discuss next week.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, that's where the confusion was. Okay, great, thank you.
I just want to just let councils know, I'm actually moving a briefing note. We're going to circulate that briefing note to get that information next week. So I'll be moving that motion shortly.
So can I just want to put a fine point, because I think my question, and with respect, Councillor McKelvey's was a bit different. My question was whether or not he can estimate by polling the councillors who's actually going to want to, because it isn't all of us. So not just if we do two, but to the best of our knowledge, what it would cost to accommodate the motion, which was at the request of.
So through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor, we are working on the assumption that we will be providing two to every ward and working to identify the resources required to move that forward. And we are right now canvassing councillors' offices to see which council would like to have two, but we will be working on the assumption that there are two per ward and be bringing that back with the briefing note next week.
Councillor, I could maybe amend.
Yeah, I think you know where I'm going. I'm wondering if we could, that's why I asked if the councillors are being polled. Could the briefing note contain the request that we get both options, the results of the survey, how many we'd actually need, because it's probably not 50?
So through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor, we will provide all the updated information that we've been delivered by councillors on their request to have one or two or none in their wards in that briefing note, if we are provided that information in time to put it in the briefing note.
Okay, next is Councillor Nunziata.
I'm surprised. This is an awful lot of money for Environment Day. Had no idea. But is there any way that you can give us, I mean, there might be a way for us to find savings from this amount, like just tell us exactly what the $605,000 provides. Like maybe there's certain things that we don't need, and we can still host an Environment Day with having two rather than one. Like there must be a way. This is awfully expensive.
So through you, Mr. Chair, to
Yeah.
the councillor, that information will be provided in the briefing
I
note.
can't hear you. Councillor Layton, please? I can't hear. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I didn't hear you.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor, all that information will be provided in detail within the briefing note.
In detail what the total cost, so there's an opportunity maybe to you know, delete some of the you know, what you provide for Environment Day, so there could be, we can cut that down a bit,
Through you,
correct?
Mr. Chair, to the councillor, we will do everything we can to
Yeah.
work within that budget and provide that information to the committee next week.
Because there are some things that the city has been providing that I don't really think we needed, and there could have been a savings there, but you've allocated it in the budget, so you're paying for it anyway, even if we don't use it. So maybe we can find ways. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Layton.
Yes, and perhaps I'd just take this as more of a statement in case the briefing note's being prepared. Councillor Nunziata, no, I'm going to say something positive. I think she may be getting there a little bit, because there are those of us that probably don't need the full contingent at either Environment Day or at a secondary Environment Day, but could certainly use the hazardous waste pickup, could use the compost drop. Many of us will already be doing quite a few more. And that would actually allow us to be more strategic about the geographic placement of them if there was a Environment Day light. I seconded the motion at council, and I'll support a full 2 Environment Days. But to be honest, I wasn't planning on signing up for another one. But if it could be a light version that allowed us to put the almost just the household hazardous and perhaps an electronics, that would be more than enough for the second one, and if that cut down on costs. Because I understand there's the costs of the collecting material, and then there are also 4 or 5 other booths of city staff there that are there about other issues that probably once would be sufficient. So if there's a way of crafting this in such a way that allows for more at a less expensive rate, I think you might find that you have some, there might be councillors that want full too, but there may be some that opt for an Environment Day light.
I think the staff have heard clearly what the expectations of the briefing note are. Councillor McKelvey, did you have a question?
Yeah, just quickly, from the Environment Days last year, and to help people decide, what they need, do you know what was picked up in all the different words and the volumes, so that could help them? If you turned it to like a menu and you pick and choose, that would help councillors with selections?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor, we can provide that in the briefing note as well, what materials generally are collected in specific areas and the overall volumes of those materials.
Thank you. Next, Josie.
Okay, so that takes care of solid waste. So finally, there is one motion that was placed at the last meeting that will be referred to final wrap-up. That's on page 8 regarding the Toronto Parking Authority. I won't read that, but that was tabled at the last meeting and will get referred and dealt with for a report back as part of the 2020 budget process. Okay? All right, so turning to page 9, now it's any reports for consideration before you. So for Toronto Water, it's the budget notes recommending the operating budget. The recommendations are highlighted here before you. So approval of the operating budget does provide authority for the delivery of the services and a capital from current contribution that then helps to fund our capital. And you can see the value for 2019. And of course, this has to be considered with the rate report that's also before you. And if you turn the page on to 10, it sets the report here, sets out the rates and service fees for 2019. Overall, it's a 3% water rate increase, but with an effective rate of 3.98%, given the time of budget approval. And the rates are set out. So that will be for consideration as well at our final wrap-up. If there are no questions, I'll continue. Okay. So moving to page 13, for solid waste management services, similarly, we have the recommendations on the operating budget, which are found starting on the bottom of page 13. So if you turn to page 14, you can see the allocation or the funding of each of the services in solid waste. Their capital from current contribution is $20 million to help pay for their capital program. And then on page 15 is the report that recommends the solid waste rates and fees for 2019. If you see in the status response column on page 15, what are the rate increases for the various groups for multi-residential, single family, and so on. That continues, all the recommendations that are before you continues through to page 17. Are there any questions on those? I can move forward.
Councillor Carroll.
Yeah, just a quick question on solid waste, because I hadn't noticed that. Not reading the fine print and the recommendations. So is the capital from current contribution in the rate-supported budgets also less than 10%? Anyone? Bueller?
You're reading right now.
Okay.
Put your time on hold.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the change from last year on the capital from current contribution for solid waste is a $1.7 million reduction, which represents an 8% reduction.
But the dollars, so that's a reduction in capital from current, but the dollars overall still stay in that rate-supported budget. They're not moving over here.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you, just checking.
Any other questions? Seeing none?
Okay, so we're now going to move to the Toronto Parking Authority on page 17. So this is the balance of the bike share program report that's before you as it relates to the operating side. So essentially what this report is trying to set out are the financial principles to continue with the bike share program, understanding that we have had deficits in the past. What we're also trying to do through here is deal with those deficits and move forward. And so one of the issues that I think we've had with the bike share program is we've tried to see if it was a self-sustaining model. So far, in terms of our practices, it has not been. It does rely on sponsorship. And so we are continuing to try to move forward on that basis. And so some of the principles out here identify what to do in the event that that doesn't happen. But and the other part of this is to really ensure that it becomes part of the overall mobility strategy.
Questions? No, I think we're good.
Okay. So then turning to page 20, that sets out the operating recommendations for the Toronto Parking Authority. Again, it's three services that are provided and net revenue of $66.5 million, of which some of that goes to them for retained earnings to pay for their capital, and through the income sharing agreement comes to the city. And that would be it, Mr. Chair.
I think we're good.
Okay, so that's all of the rate budgets.
Colleagues, what I was going to suggest is have some motions that are just administrative to move everything to next week to make a decision. And I had that one briefing note request for the environment days. I thought if we could move all that now so we can get the rate done. So at least they're done and staff don't have to wait around. Councillor. Oh, Councillor Nunziata had one more. So why don't they're in pink in front of you, so I've distributed them. Oh, okay, Councillor Nunziata just put in a briefing note request, so we may, you know what, we may have to, yeah, actually, we're going to unfortunately have to stand it down till we get that note in. So she has one briefing note request that has to be added to the pinks here. Okay, unfortunately, clerks will have to wait a few minutes, so we will have to just move on and do this.
I'm sorry, I should have put it in
Which is fine.
sooner.
No worries. Okay, Josie, so we'll...
Okay, so now we're moving to the tax budget. We'll start with capital. So again, the blue sheets, top right-hand corner is a box says BU 3.4. So we'll start with briefing notes one more time. So the first briefing note regarding our tax-supported capital program is one that has been issued corporately by financial planning. It is an overall briefing note on state of good repair backlog that's just provided some additional words to the information that was presented in the launch. So what it's noting, of course, is that over the 10-year period, our funding is almost $20 million for state of good repair projects, or we're at about 50%. But with that, we're seeing a decline in our state of good repair. But once you pull back the Gardner Expressway revitalization and Toronto Water, it's actually going up. We have contributors to that increase, which include, of course, transportation services with updated asset values, the addition of our TCHC backlog estimate, and I just want to be really clear, that's in the absence of any additional funding beyond the interim funding that's been provided to the end of 19. Working on strategies going forward, that number would be coming down, and we are expected to report back this year on moving forward on that. So we have some additional amounts where we're seeing programs going higher, TTC facilities, Parks, Forestry and Recreation, and Toronto Public Library. This does not include the latest information that we've received from TTC on their capital investment plan. We have work to do with them so we can assess that before we add it to our backlog estimates. But we actually do have some programs where the backlog is declining, and they've been highlighted here. And moving forward, we will be revisiting the 10-year capital plan. We need to continue the work we do on aligning our cash flow funding with project activities based on stage gating and readiness to proceed, because we're still seeing underspending in this area. We're going to be looking at, other funding strategies to help support the city in trying to reduce this backlog. And then, of course, we have to set priorities not only for backlog, for state of good repair projects, but up against the service improvement and growth projects so that we can move this information forward. I guess the last point is that over the last few years, our priority on state of good repair has been to ensure that there's funding in all the divisions and agencies to ensure the city is AOTA compliant.
Questions? Councillor Perks.
So you'll have to forgive me. I'm tracking too many different documents at the same time. What is the total, as of today, state of good repair backlog?
So through Mr. Chair, it's on page 3 of the briefing note. At the end of 2018, as a dollar value, it's $7.5 billion. That takes into account the tax and rate-supported programs and agencies.
Okay, and as a percentage of asset value?
9.5%.
9.5%. And at the end of 10 years, what are we projecting it will be in dollar and percentage?
8.9, almost $9 billion, and 8.6, sorry, wrong column. $9.5 billion and 8.8%.
9.5 billion.
Right.
So about a 20% increase.
So as an
Dollar
absolute value, it's going up about $2 billion. As a percentage, it's actually going down, and that's because we're seeing the value, the total asset value, actually increasing through the 10-year period.
And that's principally the Gardner.
Sorry.
Pardon me?
So we have asset values increasing through the 10-year period as new assets.
And that's principally the Gardner Expressway.
And Toronto Water.
And Toronto Water. Okay. And so 1 point of property tax is worth about $30 million a year. Over a 10-year period, how much capital does that fund if you debenture it and then pay it on a 10-year debenture?
So a 1%. So if we were to use the funds from the 1% to repay the debt servicing?
Yeah, you could carry additional debt.
Right. So about 0.5% is about $1 billion.
0.5% is $1 billion?
Over a 10,
Over 10
20-year
years. So
20 or
1%, and we would
30-year
not see
period.
the absolute value of the backlog grow.
So that would be over a 30-year period, right?
Over a 30-year
Yes.
debenture. Okay. And which agencies and departments, and if for transportation, could you give it to me exclusive of the Gardner, will see their capital repair backlog grow as a percentage of asset value?
So through you, Mr. Chair, if you look on page 5 of the briefing note, we've highlighted the key ones. So transportation services.
Yeah.
We're seeing over the 10-year period a change of $2.6 billion, so that's a major increase.
Okay.
But that is a result of updated information and audits,
Yep.
as well as assets coming to the end of their useful life. For the TTC, the number that's represented there of $729 million only reflects that portion of their capital that goes below the line because of their capacity to spend. So we have yet to do the work around the capital improvement plan estimates, so that will grow. Parks, Forestry, and Recreation, well, you can see the numbers here. Public Library, again, Toronto Community Housing Corporation, this is the first year we've had this estimate added to our backlog, and again, it's in the absence of any additional funding, which we know we have work to do, both with them and with our other orders of government in terms of
if I could pause on that one for a minute. So going back, the idea that was that we would do a third, and actually, as I recall, the proposal was that we would get a sales tax. This is 2 city managers ago to pay our third. Do we have in hand an agreement from the federal government for their third, the provincial government for our third, and do we have a proposal for their third, and do we have a proposal for where the money would come from for our third?
So through you, Mr. Chair, the answer would be not at this time on all 3.
Okay, so even if the federal government say were to come forward with a third, we have no plan at all for what we would do to pay for our third?
So through you, Mr. Chair, that's the work that staff actually have in their work plan this year to review that. We have been asked by council to come back with that very requirement as we are doing, as staff are doing work around tenants first and other kinds of elements.
But that would require some new funding from somewhere, and there's no current council direction to create new funding for anything.
Not at
Last
this
question,
time.
Councillor.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions on this briefing note? Councillor Carroll?
I was trying to square the circle when you gave Councillor Perks the number 7.5 billion gross to 9.5 billion, but the percentage of assets goes down because the Gardner hybrid is a state of good repair project. It's classified as state of good repair.
So yes.
So if I pull it out, if I wanted to pull it out of these numbers, I'd pull it out of the number today, and then it disappears from the state of good repair backlog. So the growth, if I take out the Gardner, 7.5 billion minus, I'm sorry, what is the 10-year cost of the hybrid?
So, but through you, Mr. Chair, actually, page 4 will give you that information. We've taken out both the Gardner as well as the Toronto Water capital program, because those are the 2 areas of decline.
I apologize for taking a while to get there. I'll just flag for you now the reason it took me a while to get there. The briefing note in the agenda just now, the links to the briefing notes on the tax supported one, I couldn't open it on the briefing note online version. So but I found my way there through the budget page. So on page 4, the chart I'm looking at shows me what? That's the accumulated backlog without the Gardner in it? Is that what you're saying?
That's correct, without the
Okay,
Gardner
thank
and
you.
without Toronto Water's State of Good Repair program.
Okay, that is the number I've been looking for. Okay, thank you. So if we have a presentation again at council, this graph will be highlighted?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, in fact, at the launch, we actually showed this. It was dynamic, so we showed the first and then the second, but yes, we'll show it again.
I missed it because you exceeded my 30-slide maximum. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions on this briefing note? Seeing none, let's move on to the next.
Okay, bottom of page 3, again, that's coming from our, from financial planning. It's not before you yet. We are still working on this. This was a request for the estimated unmet capital needs for the City of Toronto over the 10-year period, so that will be here for the February 20th wrap-up meeting. Turning the page to page 4. So those were the corporate ones. Now we'll get into the program-specific ones. The first is for economic development and culture, briefing note number 14. And it was a request about the delays to building condition audits, and will there be any risk or damage associated with that. So that briefing note is here for your consideration.
Questions? Nope. I
Okay.
think we're good. Oh, Councillor Layton.
The $700,000 that's in the unmet capital need, is that to do the assessments, or is that the cost of, I find it hard to believe that would be the state of good repair.
To do these.
That's correct.
That's just to figure out how much.
Figure how much over 10 years to do the building condition audits.
Okay, and that's unfunded.
Correct.
So what's unfunded is both the unmet capital need, and what's unknown is the amount that is unfunded for that capital, that upkeep, that
Correct.
state of good repair. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Next one, shelter support and housing is briefing note number 22. Request on the current status and estimated cost of funding Regent Park phases 4 and 5, including the social development plan and the new community safety plan. So that's here before you. And based on current TCHC projections, the cost for phase 4 is $132.4 million and $216.6 million for Regent Park phase 5, total of about $350 million. And it also explains just where we are in the process. And so my understanding is that there's a search for a developer for these, and the RFP will be released shortly. And costs associated with implementing the two plans have not been determined at this point in time. Sorry,
Questions?
Where it doesn't say anything is if we're on track. How is this compared to what we thought and where we would be 5 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years ago?
Through the chair. We were a little bit delayed 2 years ago with Block 16 and 17 in Regent Park, which we came to council for funding for. So we're anticipating a completion now of 2030.
And what was the original projected completion date when we were first putting the plan together?
So originally, the Regent Park revitalization started in 2006 and was projected to be a 15-year build-out at that time.
So that's a 9-year difference.
Yeah. I mean, through the chair, there have been modifications to the Regent Park plan. If you take a look at the original plan that was approved in 2006, it didn't incorporate a large park in the middle of the community. It didn't include any of the MLSE sports fields, the Daniel Spectrum, the aquatic center. So there have been modifications along the way. We also went for a rezoning in 2013.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I think we're done. Colleagues, I just got a request from the clerk's office. They may not be able to be here to answer questions when we get to their operating. So I'm just wondering if it's possible. It's briefing note number 36 from city clerks, which is the 2022 projected election costs. And I'm just wondering if we could go to, it's the green sheets. I'm just wondering if maybe we could go to that one first. So it's on the green sheet. It's briefing note number 36. It's in the green sheets for operating. I don't know who, Councillor Perks, you may have asked for that. Briefing note, okay. We can just maybe.
Anything for you,
Do you want to go through that, Josie, quickly, and then we'll see if everyone can grab the questions? So it's number 36 in the green sheets.
Page 36?
No, number 36 at the end of the green sheets in operating.
Mr. Chair, if I may,
Briefing note
it's
number
also on page 9 of the capital sheets, the blue sheets.
Okay, right.
Thank you. So page 9 of the blue and page,
Right. So through you, Mr. Chair, a briefing note was asked about, from the city clerk about the costs of in the coming years to remain compliant. There's a capital component on page 8 of the blue sheets and an operating component on page 30 of the green sheets. So the capital deals with the cost of the tabulators and any other election-related supports versus the cost of the election itself.
okay, Councillor Perks, did you do questions on capital or operating or both?
Well, it affects both, unfortunately. This is on the tabulators. I guess it's the capital budget. So the note I have here says the tabulators have reached the end of their life, but that the costs to replace them are not currently included in the 10-year capital plan. If we were to include them, what would the recommendation be?
Mr. Chair, until we go out with an RFP, we won't know those costs. I can't even begin to take a guess.
But you can't go out for an RFP until we put something in the budget. So maybe to the city manager, which came first, this chicken or this egg? I mean, we have these things that are at the end of their life. I'm told I can't find out how much it costs unless we put money in, and we can't put money in until we know how much it costs. So how do we get out of this conundrum?
Mr. Chair, if I can take a stab at answering the question. The Municipal Elections Act actually gives the clerk what I call requisitioning authority for election costs. So when we expend money, we are required to simply certify those costs, and the section says the municipality shall pay. It does not give the city a choice. So our
I want your job.
That's what it says, and that's what our briefing note explains. And there's reasons for that, which are obviously to ensure that democracy is protected and that we are not required to take shortcuts, if I can say that, in order to run an election. So I think what we will do, and there is a note, I think in the budget currently it's roughly $16 million. I expect it could be more, it could be less. That's probably not a bad number to leave there for now. But I really don't know until we do the study of whether we should buy or lease. I mean, remember also that leasing will require a somewhat different funding model than we currently have. So
I understand that you have this, that you hold this legal trump card, and it's just so cool for you. But we have to pass a budget, and a budget has to have numbers in. So while you can just go spend the money, we should really put something aside. I'm going to push you here. What placeholder number would you recommend that we consider for this budget?
The difficulty is that we don't know whether it's a capital cost or an operating cost.
I understand. So in either world, let's say you do it as a capital cost. It could be an annual contribution to a reserve over X number of years. If it's a leasing cost, it would just be a running thing. So I really am going to push you here to give me, let's say you want to amortize it over 10 years and or do a lease. What placeholder number would be the best? And of course, we can adjust it next year if we're too high or too low.
I can't tell you what the number is, Councillor. What I can ask is financial planning to address an issue of a strategy for funding the unknown number at this point. And you all know that it was in the budget for many years as a question mark, and the number did get lowered, but I can't tell you what that number is going to be.
Okay, so I heard the number 16 million. I'm just going to arbitrarily say a 10-year amortization, and with some interest costs and stuff, I'm going to say if we started putting aside $2 million a year, that would certainly help, and we could adjust it as we know more. Is that reasonable?
I think financial planning needs to comment on that.
I got my teeth in the bone here, Josie.
So through you, Mr. Chair, it's 2019. If we need tabulators for 2022 and we are purchasing them, then 16 million over the years, 4 years, 2 million would contribute to but not pay for it.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Carroll?
Just a quick question. So we heard about this certification authority. So you don't need a motion from us to give you the authority to come back in 2020. But given the length of procurement, et cetera, we should expect to see some dialogue about this in the next analyst notes or the ones after that.
Mr. Chair, there will be a report that you see this year that outlines our options, council's options, and how we would expect to proceed with any of those. Yes,
Okay.
that's correct. That has to happen this year.
Right. And does council need to give you, or have they already given you direction that whatever technology we look at should be able to meet the requirements of rank balloting? Should they adopt it at some wonderful day in the future?
I think I addressed this issue at the last meeting, Mr. Chair. What I said was that, yes, of course, we will look at all of council's options under the legislation, ranked choice being one of them, and we will ensure that whatever we come back with is capable of counting votes in that methodology.
Meeting the legislation. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I forgot that.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, I guess we can go back to the original capital. And
Yes.
We're going to go back to the blue sheets.
Okay, so we were on page 5, Mr. Chair, so through you, we're now moving to the bottom of page 5, corporate services. There was briefing note number 31, directed to the General Manager Facilities Management, asking about whether the deferral of payment towards accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act puts the city at risk of being out of compliance with the province mandated deadline. So the briefing note outlines that the capital plan actually has $192.5 million to fund the implementation for city facilities. That was actually provided in 2018. And that they've looked at various measures to streamline the implementation, to ensure that everything is being done by 2025, as well as measures to mitigate any risks. So the fact that there's approved multi-year funding is actually to help move that forward and mitigate the risks to any program delivery.
Questions? Councillor Layton?
Thank you very much. I may have missed something. Councillor Perks, you're writing on my briefing note. Thank you. The realignment that's happening in 2019, can you explain the necessity of that?
Through the chair, when we did the original forecast in 17 for the 18 through 27, we had just started the audits of the AOD of the facilities, so it was more of a projected spend based on what we knew then. In 18, we completed all of the audits and had conducted jurisdictional scans on the best way to approach the program. And now that we knew exactly what was required in each of the facilities and knew how to realign the program implementation, we actually realigned the cash flow to meet the projected completion dates of each of the projects.
It's a pretty significant realign for 2019. What was the delay in completing the building assessments?
Well, we completed them because we were doing 427. We broke it up into lots, and there was so much information. It's a lot of information that we received on each of them because we were doing both AODA audits as well as the Toronto Accessibility Design Guidelines. So there's a lot of information for all of the facilities. We've actually now created a database to actually load all that information in because it's important that over the course of the program that we actually document what we've completed in each buildings and also to support people, equity, and human rights on their reporting. So we want to be able to track all of the reporting as well. It's a very large program based on the amount of work we need to do. So we want to be very succinct on delivering this project.
Okay, so we're realigning because, not because there's some lack of space within the capital budget.
No, it's more how we've developed the project plan for implementation, and the cash flow is reflective of that.
And does any of it have to do with capacity, project management capacity?
No, so what we've done is through the capital funding as well, we've allotted for 3 FTE, a senior project manager, and a program project coordinator, just strictly to deliver on the program delivery, so that they'll focus on working with the design groups to get the tenders out, and then the actual PMO project team will then do the delivery of the project. So we're separating that out. That's why we're doing the bundling. So 2 separate groups will manage it, and the program group will also manage the reporting.
Okay, and just finally, there's a pretty hefty number that could result, that we could be fined as a result of not completing our AOD requirements. We've got to report back this year, in December this year, on our status. Should we be concerned with generating a significant fine from the provincial government, or no?
At this stage, based on, because we're just rolling out the program, no, I would say no at this time.
Because we've got a plan?
We've got a project plan, yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Councillor Carroll.
Is this really, does this really give effect to capital coordination? Are some of the 20 million, is that because in facilities managed places, we were doing the AODA work in conjunction with other capital works? And so we've just, by jurisdictional scan, you mean you went looking to see when other projects were happening?
No, a jurisdiction, what we were looking at is other organizations that do multi-year, multi-projects. That was a jurisdictional scan. We did it with, looked at financial institutions that have multi-locations across the country.
I see.
So what we did was, so the jurisdictional scan came back that what they did is they did RFP to get one design firm, architecture firm, to go for the duration of the project. So they would set up a team just to do design, and then do a team just so that we can bundle tenders, because we want, so we're bundling the tenders and tenders of 10. We looked at each of our client groups, like Toronto Police, Fire and EMS, to make sure, or Toronto Paramedic Services, to make sure that we're only doing 5 or 6 a year with them, so that we're not impeding their operations as well. So that was the jurisdictional scan. Okay, so it was the best practice on how to deliver a multi-year, multi-like projects.
So then I have the reverse question. Was there also a lens of capital coordination such that in moving some of our things around to bundle, we didn't then shoot ourselves in the foot with respect to, oh, they're working on that division and we're going to go back the year later?
No, so that's one of the things we're looking at as well. So there's the state of good repair. So we've got a touch it once policy. So if the AO will also include the state of good repair for any of those sites.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, next.
Okay, so we're now on page 7. Another requested briefing note from the Deputy City Manager, Corporate Services. It's briefing note number 32, with a question around when the St. Lawrence Market South Construction Project business case is anticipated, when it will be completed, and the status. So that briefing note's before you. It highlights that the South Construction Project is currently at 90% detailed design of completion. That work also includes bringing forward a business case on the financial performance of the newly renovated lower level and comparing what the revenue and performance would be after the renovation versus right now, and that the report will be coming forward in Q2 that seeks Council's approval for designing the business case. And should that move forward, it'll be another priority to be considered as part of the 2020 budget process.
Is there any way of putting on behalf?
Questions? Councillor Wong Tam.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you. With respect to the business plan that is going to be designed in consultation with the St. Lawrence Precinct Advisory Committee, what would be the evaluation framework for that? How will you determine which direction to go. There are a lot of long-term stakeholders and occupants who have a particular way of conducting business. There will be obviously a retail strategy that will have to come into play, that will be able to, that you have to meet some financial obligations to, and then there is the underlying layer of just the historical operators, the long-time operators that are there that may not want to see big shifts. How would you evaluate all those competing interests?
So through the chair, those are all good points, and those are all factors that are going to be layered on top of making the decision on a go-forward basis. Some considerations will be provided perhaps in phasing the project if it does have those impacts, in order for us not to interrupt the current fabric of the St. Lawrence Market Precinct.
And do you believe that the phasing effect will be enough to mitigate some of those competing opinions?
We will work closely with the St. Lawrence Market Precinct Advisory Committee, the local councillor, and the tenants of the St. Lawrence Market South to look for a strategy that we would be able to unroll this plan if it is adopted and it makes sense to perform it in such way.
Okay. And is there anything in the budget right now, either if it's present or perhaps it's missing, is there anything else that we need to know about the St. Lawrence South redevelopment that is not contained in this particular briefing note?
Not in particular to the renovations of the lower level. This is all captured within the briefing note and the budget that has been put aside for that task.
Okay, so really what we're waiting for is just the anticipated business case. Once it's ready for public review, it'll be brought back to City Council.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, we'll go on to the next briefing note.
So we're on page 8, through Mr. Chair. A request again for the General Manager, Facilities Management, to provide a briefing note listing all the security cost changes, operating and capital. So briefing note number 34, it provides both the capital and the operating. On page 8, it outlines the capital costs. And if you want to address the operating at the same time, it's page 28 of the green sheets that outlines the operating.
Questions? Number 34, page 8.
Briefing note number 34, page 8 of capital, and page 28 of operating gives you the capital and operating costs associated with security increases.
I think we're good. Okay, next.
Through Mr. Chair, we just dealt with the city clerk's briefing note number 36, so we can turn now to page 10. That concludes briefing note requests related to the capital program, the tax-supported capital program. Starting on page 10 are motions that were placed at the last meeting that we would be considering at our final wrap-up. The first for city planning regarding the amount of Section 37 funds to be secured for affordable housing over the next 5 years. The next motion was for the Toronto Transit Commission, asking City Council, asking City Manager to work with the TTC and report back again for the 2020 budget process on requests made to the other orders of government for operating and capital investments and projected funds available from other orders of government in the 10-year program. So that's a motion to come back. On page 11 is a member's motion that came as a referral to this budget process back in June. Member motion 43.48. It was entitled Development Charges for the Leslie Nymark Toronto Community Housing Corporation Redevelopment. So direction was given from council to consider a one-time increase in funding to TCHC to fully compensate them for any reduction in profit from the Leslie Nymark Revitalization Project due to development charge increases related to construction delays. So what we actually have in the capital program when we provided interim funding to TCHC We provided state of good repair funding for 2 years, as well as in-flight revitalization projects. So in the shelter, support, and housing's capital budget for 2019 is almost $22 million to fully fund the Leslie Nymark project. But there is no additional funds for any changes in the costs of development charges. And my understanding is that is potentially an impact that's not for 2019, but 2021.
Councillor Carroll?
Yeah, some questions here, because this is a long story, but as revitalizations often are, but it's a situation that could happen in any of them. So the intent here, and I think it was Councillor Shiner who helped Councillor Sal with this. The intent here is to make sure that, as in any revitalization, TCHC isn't bearing the development charge impact.
Through the chair, that's correct.
Yeah. So my understanding now, because scheduling has been difficult, there have been a couple of issues with getting the shovel in the ground here, that the true cost of the impact on TCHC isn't known at this time.
It's just an estimate now based on what we know at the time in terms of the agreement of purchase and sales with the condo purchasers and the timing of when we're going to be pulling permits.
So if this motion was referred to the 2020 budget process, if that's in order, Mr. Chair, because we would know the exact amount then, if the bill came due and TCHC were required to pay up, would they be able to absorb it if council was to be able to address this in the 2020 budget, or would you have to come to us for an in-year adjustment?
Yeah.
We would be in a position where we'd have to absorb it and look at efficiencies somewhere else within our budget.
And we're talking a couple of $1 million here.
The current estimate's about 1.5 million.
So the current estimate is about 1.5 million. If we refer it to the 2020 budget process, we'd have to give direction to you so that you'd have to know that you could come to us for an in-year adjustment of some sort. We'd need language of that sort in this budget. Okay, so we'll address that by, it's possible that I could work with staff to come up with a motion by wrap-up that actually makes sure that we're doing that. I understand this was referred to budget because it wasn't clear if we were making TCHC whole or the private developer whole. Now that we're clear it's the TCHC amount we're concerned about, can I move a motion at last minute wrap-up?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Next week.
Thank you.
Any other questions on these items? Okay, Josie, I guess we're going.
Okay, so that ends the number of motions that are before you on our capital program. So moving to page 12, we now will be addressing reports and referrals for consideration. So the first one is item 3.4F. That's on the clerk's agenda. It's a letter dated from City Council, Vision Zero Road Safety Plan, implementation of community safety zones. And the recommendations directing Budget Committee consider funding the implementation of the community safety zones at every school in Toronto, including high schools and private schools, part of the 2019 budget. So there is funding of $1.250 million in the 10-year capital plan for transportation to do this.
Questions, Councillor Layton?
To our General Manager of Transportation Services, is 1.25 million included over that period of time enough to develop school safety zones, community safety zones at all schools in Toronto, including high schools and private schools?
Through the chair, in 2018, $1 million provided us with implementation at 350 schools. The 1.25 in 2019 would enable us to do an additional 400 schools, bringing the number to 750. The additional 200 sites have not yet been bylawed, so they're not included in this funding request. So that's the amount that we requested in order to accelerate the program to get it completed.
And so how many schools a year is that?
It was between 350 and 400. So we did 350 in 2018, and we're planning to do 400 in 2019.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, next.
Item 3.4G, again, it's a letter, it's from City Council regarding implementation of additional road safety measures and accelerating the Vision Zero Road Safety Plan. So that is before Budget Committee for consideration about the allocation of additional funds for the Vision Zero project. On the right-hand side, it gives a bit of a history around what was funded in 2018, which accelerated the then 5-year plan. So there was 3 years worth of funds. As we all know, there was additional funding of $22 million provided in June. So over the period of time, and then this capital plan includes capital funding of $57.387 million from 2019 to 2021 to complete this phase. And then there's an expectation that staff will be reporting in 19 on the next 5-year plan.
Councillor Layton.
So the phase 1 is 2019 to 22, and what's phase 2? Sorry, 2019 to 2021. What's phase 2?
Through the chair, the first phase was 2017 through 2021, which we've accelerated. So we are coming back to council with the Vision Zero 2.0 plan in June, I believe, to talk about the next 5 years.
Okay, so we don't yet have a number for phase 2.
That's correct. We'll be coming back with that and how it affects the capital plan as a result of that discussion in June.
So how much were we able to accelerate the work by the addition of the 22 million?
Through the chair, we committed the entire 22 million, I believe actually it was 24 because we did additional work with Toronto Hydro that was able to be accommodated through our base. We were able to spend approximately 14 million by the end of December, and the rest we needed to wait for the good weather to complete in 2019, but that work is programmed.
So we were able to add $14 million to the capital program to implement it over and above what we thought we could at the beginning of the year, or what we had funding for at the beginning of the year. Had we had that funding the year prior, would we have been able to implement the program and be completed that work by now?
Through the chair, I'm going to say that it was probably better placed in the 2018 budget, given the technologies that we brought online that we were not yet utilizing in 2017. So I think there was more ability for us to implement a broader suite of tools that were envisioned in the 2016 plan that council adopted, but really needed a little bit more technical work to be able to understand what that rollout would be.
And is there any way of advancing the 2020 or 2021 work into an earlier program, into 2019, or 2021 work into 2020? I'm just saying, have we accelerated as much as we can the program, and what barriers are in place for us accelerating it more?
So within existing resources, I think it would be difficult to continue to accelerate, but I do think one of the things that council directed us to do as part of this acceleration in 2018 was to look at how we can make every capital project that we do much more consistent with the goals of Vision Zero and complete streets. And so one of the things you'll see when we come back in June is a better assessment of how our capital design over the course of the 10-year program is going to better reflect the vision and goals of Vision Zero.
So just very quickly, you said within your existing resources, it would be difficult to implement. Am I to believe that if you had, say, additional transportation planners or project managers within your staffing envelope, that we'd be able to implement plans faster?
Through the chair, I actually think it's, we've been working very hard to get a lot of projects designed into the capital budget and through the coordination process so that we can really deliver significantly in 2021, which is the 2 years that we need to do that coordination. So I'm not sure it's really a staffing issue. It's really a project design issue and a project coordination issue, given that we have a lot of coordination requirements with our other municipal partners.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Seeing no other questions, we'll go on to the next.
Okay, so through you, Mr. Chair, the next series of reports that are before the committee are transmittal letters from our accountability officers who have capital programs. So starting at the bottom of page 13, item 3.4C is from the lobbyist registrar that has a capital request in for a total of $1.165 million. It's to deal with $215,000 for a new case management system that's required for investigative work. And then on page 14, there's an additional $950,000 in the 10-year period, $700 for state of good repair, and also another $250,000 to upgrade the investigations case management system that's being requested for 2019. So that's for your consideration. Item 3.4D is from the Office of the Ombudsman. Again, it's a capital request. It is a total of $700,000, and that is to replace the Ombudsman's Toronto case management system in 24-25. So seeing if there are no questions there, we turn to page 15. Transmittal from the Board of Health regarding Toronto Public Health capital plan. So what the Board of Health has recommended versus what we have in the 10-year capital plan as staff is not the same. So what we have that's before you in the staff recommended capital budget and plan includes an additional $660,000 for funding being carried forward for 2018 projects underway. So the numbers are a little bit higher in that regard. If you turn the page, page 16, the other difference is that there was a project that was before the Board of Health that we have not included, which is a document and records management system implementation. So that has been placed below the line, as we call it, or in the unmet needs, as it is not quite ready to proceed. It is contingent on other corporate efforts that are going on, and through the review that we have through our IT governance committees, it was deemed that this should wait a year. So that decision happened after the item was before the Board of Health. But for all intents and purposes, except for carry forward funding in the one project, then what's before you is, for the most part, consistent with Board of Health recommendations.
Any questions? No, I think we're good.
Okay. So the final one is the transmittal from the Toronto Transit Commission. So overall, what we have before us is a 10-year capital plan that's $6.453 billion. For the base TTC program, it is, staff recommended capital plan is exactly the same. As it relates to the Scarborough subway extension of $3.3 billion, it's exactly the same. There is a closeout amount of money of $60 million for the Toronto York extension that is in there, and hopefully is the end of the funding for that project. So the one area where we have some difference between what the commission saw and what we have before us is in transit studies program. So we have an additional $24 million that was added in the TTC capital plan for work being done on the Dufferin Bridge in 2021. We do not have that included and recommended because there is work to be done with transportation and with Metrolinx to ensure that we have alignment around the timing. But other than that, then all is the same. Any questions?
Questions? Councillor Perks?
Well, since we're at the transit expansion budget, how much will the Scarborough subway cost? I mean, it's a big budget commitment on the part of the City of Toronto, and I'm just kind of curious how much it's going to cost.
Through the chair, Councillor, thank you for the question. We're coming forward, I believe it's in April, with an update on the expected cost of what we're calling now the Line 2 East Extension.
Line 2 East Extension, that's the fourth name it's had. I was assured that at the, I want to say, July meeting of council, that we would have those numbers in January of this year.
I'll play the card, if I may, Councillor, through the chair. I joined in April, so I apologize. I wasn't at that meeting, but I have been sitting in meetings where we've been talking about upcoming TTC board meetings, and I'm fairly confident that the April meeting, so our next board meeting is February 27th. Our very next board meeting after that is April 11th, I believe, and that's the meeting that the updated cost is coming forward to.
Okay, so what do we know about the cost of the Scarborough subway, or the Line 2 East Extension, I guess I have to call it now, that we didn't know in June of last year? Do we know anything new?
I'm going to be a little careful in what I say, only because it's not my file. It is the file of Gary Downey as the Chief of Transit Expansion. But I believe from the meetings that I've been in, I believe that the TTC board and through the board, City Council will be quite impressed with the volume of work that has gone on in station design, track design, property owner negotiations, and so on. So we're coming.
A lot of work has been done.
Yes, and once you get to what's known as 30% design, you have a fairly high degree of specificity, and that is what we're coming forward with in April. We're coming forward with a stage gate 3 number that we'll have a lot of confidence in, and a ton of information in behind it.
So given all this impressive work that has been done, and I see staff sitting beside you who do the budgeting for the TTC, what is it that you know now that we didn't know 6 months ago in terms of the impacts on costs?
Well, again, I'm going to give you I apologize, a general answer through the chair. But we have had quite a few engineers, architects, engineering technicians on our staff and through contractors who have been tuning up whereas previously you might have a rough sketch of a station or a rough sketch of track alignment, we now know exactly how we want to do that station, the property required to purchase it. It is hundreds upon hundreds.
Well, I've acknowledged that. I'm just asking that out of that incredible work that those really bright, hard-working individuals have done, what information can you give me now that I didn't have 6 months ago about the likely cost of the
I think you've asked the question 3 times. He has responded twice on that, and I think he's sufficiently answered it to his capability at this point. It's the 3rd time you've asked.
So you're ruling my question out of order, Mr. Chair?
I'm just suggesting you've asked that 3 times.
I've asked
and
it.
He's
Are
responded
you ruling it out
3
of
times.
order?
I'm not ruling it out of order.
Okay, then I'll wait for the answer.
The answer, unfortunately for today, is that work is being wrapped up, and I'm confident, based on what I've been hearing, that we will be back in April with the actual answer to your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. You had the same answer 3 times. Next, Councillor McKelvey.
Thank you. Has the geotechnical characterization for the Line 2 extension been completed, or what's the status of that? Are there funds in this budget for that?
Again, I'm speaking on behalf of a colleague who would understand that much better than I do, but through the chair, my understanding is that the geotechnical is well advanced.
Is significantly advanced. Does the costing that you have here include the underground Triton bus terminal?
Well, I'm going to say that I'll have to come back to you with the answer of that. There was a change to how we were doing the bus terminal, and just as a consequence of certain negotiations that happened, still the same project being delivered. So, but you're asking a very specific question, and I want to say yes generally to the idea of the bus terminal, but our thoughts on how we would do the bus terminal have changed a little bit.
And will you be reporting back on that as well?
Yes, we will.
And will that report also say like how many buses connect into this hub and where they're coming from?
We can make sure that it does.
Okay.
I believe it, I don't know if that degree of specificity was in the planned April report, but we can make sure that that specific question is answered.
And as well through that report, would we be able to, for example, look at, Greyhound and Go Transit both will use it as well, like what costs they may be contributing going forward from using those bus hubs?
I'm happy to pass that request on to my colleague and make sure it's included.
Okay. And then as for design, my understanding is that over the last year, there's been a lot of integration with the Eglinton East LRT project as well, and that's been incorporated into the design of the Line 2 extension, because the two are both coming out of Kennedy. So is that also included in some of the design work?
Yes, and we can make sure that there's added detail if necessary so that you can understand what the picture is.
And is that work on the integration of those two designs proceeded significantly as well?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the short answer is absolutely.
Thank you.
Councillor Carroll?
So just a quick question. The 3.36 billion here is contained in the 10-year plan?
Yes, it would. Well, the 10-year, yes, the short answer is yes. The 10-year plan has two components. It has the stated good repair and growth component, it has the expansion component. So it's included in the expansion component. The reason I'm I'm elaborating is that the capital investment plan that we released on January 24th is just state of good repair and growth, but we actually have a separate portion as well, which is expansion progress, and so.
Right, but it's in your 10-year numbers. And what has that now, a tremendous amount of design has gone on, and you've got a big design envelope. But is the SSE now moved to what gets expended on it is being expended in this 3.36 billion? Whether it's design or one-day procurement and et cetera, et cetera?
Sure.
Through the chair, so what we have included in the 10-year capital budget and plan specifically for Line 2's East extension is the 3.36 billion over a 10-year planning period, but that is consistent with the budget that was developed probably 5 or 6 years ago now.
Yeah.
So from when we were the original estimate, we have not updated the budget since that time. We have ensured funds are available for us to be able to continue to progress with the 30% design work that needs to be completed. And that's what's included in the funding.
Right. I'm having trouble going back and forth from platforms because the Wi-Fi is slow today, so I haven't gone back to the schedule, but that's spread out over the 10 years.
Yeah, I believe it was spread out even, the full 3.5 billion plan was spread out, I believe, over 12 or 13 years, and the 3.36 is what's included from 2019 to 2028. Okay, so that, if we get to the final stage gate, you can begin spending, but what we'll have to do is then go to the out years. From that point that we know the true cost, there'll probably be, you'll have to adjust upwards each of those years to fit it all in. To update the budget and schedule.
I'm just want to check, what did you mean adjust upwards?
Well, my crystal ball says 3.36 isn't going to pay for the whole whack. Let's put it this way, if at the final stage gate we find that that doesn't cover the full cost, then it'll be in those out years from about 2026 on that we'll be having to
Yes, through the chair,
smooth it out over those years.
Through the chair, the answer to that question would be yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Layton?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm looking at your the capital investment plan as well as this briefing note or this this letter, and I just want to get a better handle on a couple of things. One, the lines in the planned expansion are roughly prioritized. This is the planned expansion and the investment.
No, absolutely not. That is. I mean, I believe it would be a coincidence. It was just on one page. The purpose of that page through the chair, Councillor, was we wanted to acknowledge that there were other calls on capital, that it wasn't just data good repair and growth, and so we included a page that had a list of projects. It was not intended to prioritize them.
Has, and forgive me because I don't have it in front of me, has the downtown relief line long-term capital allotment changed? What money is being set aside for the planning of the downtown relief line?
Through the chair, so the 10-year capital plan that's before you includes $385 million, primarily for design, as well as funds that have been identified and added as part of this capital budget process, $325 million, for, just trying to ensure, it's essentially early work opportunities.
Okay. The Yonge Street extension, that's a partnership with York Region Metrolinx. How much are we paying?
It's through the chair, that as if I'm recalling correctly, that project is 100% funded by others with us doing the work to this point.
So we're actually doing the work on figuring out how to extend the Yonge Street line.
Sometimes, through the chair, sometimes, Councillor, you'll appreciate that a particular organization is the purse master, but you're working in collaboration with others. So on that particular project, although we hold the purse, we've been given money from funding partners. Our meetings very much involve York, Metrolinx, and so on. So it's not a case, I just want to be clear in answering, it's not a case of us doing the work in isolation.
But we're advancing that, we're primarily the ones advancing that program forward.
We have the responsibility for advancing that work.
So we're also primarily responsible for advancing the work on the DRL forward?
Yes, that's correct.
What happens if the Yonge Street extension comes online before the DRL? What happens to our capacity on the Yonge Street line?
Right. I believe this is, through the chair, this is a question we would have answered it on previous occasions, and I'm very happy to answer it again. We have a lot of concern about the ability of the Yonge line to handle capacity, even if Yonge North doesn't come online. But absolutely, we need two things to happen. Our view is, based on our forecast working in partnership with Toronto City Planning, is that both the relief line and the Yonge Bloor revitalization, similar to what happened at Union Station, need to happen before we add any significant expansion load onto the Yonge line.
Thank you, thank you. And let me ask you this: do we have a service agreement for the work we're doing around the Line 1 extension? Do we have some agreement with these other levels of government about the timing of that work?
The timing of the work, yes. Well, we receive funding and we have an agreement on what we're supposed to use the funding for and how we'll work in partnership.
Well, I'm just wondering if that work got delayed for any given reason because our resources were being put more squarely into our priority, the downtown relief line. Would there be a financial penalty, or would we just lose funding for work that we're contracted to do?
I'm going to answer through the chair very carefully. First of all, we have at previous meetings indicated a sense of responsibility for agreements that we've signed and work that we said we would deliver. So, but I would also want to say to you my observation, although it's not my file, it belongs to my colleagues Susan Reed Tanaka and Gary Downey. I believe that we are able to, I'm observing that we are able to march forward on all fronts in good collaboration. We also have to pay attention to the money that we're spending right now on Yonge North is PTIF funding, which has a hard deadline. Other sources of funding doesn't necessarily have that, but PTIF has to be spent by 2020.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Seeing no other questions, we'll move on to the next item.
So through the chair, that concludes any discussion around the TTC. So the final one is item 3.4Q, which is a transmittal from the Toronto Police Services Board with their recommendation for the 10-year capital plan for the Toronto Police Service. that is consistent with what's before you in the staff recommended 10-year capital plan, and provides funding for the replacement of their vehicle and equipment, as well as some funding for their district model, implementation, and some of their facilities.
Questions on that? Okay.
So having dealt with that, then that concludes the review of the capital tax items. And now we move to the green sheets. That has BU 3.4 and BU 3.5. So it's the last group, and it has 48 pages. So starting on page 2, what we have done here, page 2 and 3, is identified any financial implications associated with information that's been brought forward. Firstly, in briefing notes related to motions or any of the reports that are before you. So I won't go through all that, but it is there for your reference. So starting on page 4.
Man, this is...
Okay. So starting on page 4, we start with briefing notes. The first set of briefing notes are those that were issued back on February 4th. There are some corporate ones here that we do annually. The first one being actually before briefing note number 1, and it's consolidating all the changes to existing user fees and new user fees that are included in the 2019 recommended operating budget. So in accordance with the city's user fee policy, fees that are approved for automatic inflationary increases are adjusted annually based on the inflationary costs that are unique to each service. I think we've talked about the basket of goods calculation. As a result of that, there'll be additional $31.6 million in 2019 generated from that, and the briefing note lists them all in one place, but they're in every budget notes for each of the program areas. Those that have been adjusted above to reflect market prices or to recover an incremental amount to ensure full cost recovery, that will generate additional $5.7 million, and they're outlined also in that document. And finally, we have a few new user fees on the top of page 5 that are being introduced in economic development and Toronto Paramedic Services that would generate $164,000 in 2019. So as part of our requirements under the City of Toronto Act, we have to give notice of intention, which we have done, and we heard deputations on the 7th and 11th regarding these issues. Are there any questions?
Questions on number 1. Councillor Layton, then Carroll.
Yes, thank you very much. Just one note on page 4 of the briefing note under Parks, Forestry, and Rec. I think it's an important distinction that needs to be made. The 4.07% isn't the inflationary adjustment. It's a 3.07% plus an additional 1% above inflation.
Correct.
So it's not it hasn't been made distinct there. I think it needs to be. And maybe just a question directly to staff. The 1%, what is the rationale about? Like, is that a market adjustment? Did we study what's going on in other jurisdictions, or are we just saying we need an extra? We need an extra. I have the number here. Don't tell me. I don't have the number here. Do we need that extra funding to balance the books, or are we doing it because it will better reflect citywide the cost of those programs compared to other jurisdictions?
Right. Through the chair, we look at all things when we look at user fee adjustments. So we do every year do a market rate comparison with other municipalities to see where our user fees fit for the user fees that we do have. And through the jurisdictional review that we did, we saw that many of our fees were below what other market rates were, and that the additional 1% would not bring them out of line with what many other municipalities are charging.
Could we get, could we see that report? Because I heard two things there, that it wouldn't bring us out of line with other municipalities, and that compared to market, it was lower. I think it's right that compared to market, it should be lower, but comparing to other municipalities, if it's not completely out of step, I think we need a bit more of an idea of what that means.
So through the chair, if we have in years past produced some briefing notes on this that have showed some of that market analysis, if that's the direction of the committee, we'd be happy to do that.
Okay. On the transportation services user fee, on the increase at above inflation for the lane occupancy permit, is there anything saying that, like, limiting that fee for us? What's limiting us putting a greater number on that lane occupancy fee for construction?
So through the chair, when the fee was originally introduced in 2015, it was linked to the cost of on-street car parking prices, so parking meters effectively. So the fee has always been related to that. So the increase this year is simply to bring us in line with increases which TPA made to their parking rates in 2017, but we didn't update our lane occupancy fees at that point in time. So we're updating them now.
So our fees are based on parking, but lane occupancy also happens on streets without parking. Now, in areas without parking, rush hour routes, for instance, are we valuing that differently? Are we putting a particularly high value on space taken away for rush hour capacity on our roads?
No, so through the chair, so we charge the fee in relation to all roads, but we use the parking rates as a proxy for the rental value of that particular piece of road. And different types of roads, different areas have different rates associated with them.
If I was to put a value on a lane of the Gardner, would that be comparable to the parking rate that we charge? Because we charge below market parking rates. So that means the method we're using to determine the lane occupancy fees are below market. All right, doesn't that? Or are we adjusting it to be the cost of a 1 month rental parking space in the vicinity? I'm curious if there's anything that limits the amount that we can charge for those lanes. And then further, is there a way for us to charge more based on the length of time that it's taken? If it's taken for a year, we charge X. If it's taken for 2 years, we charge X times 4. If they take it for 3 years, and we're getting lane occupancy requests for 3 years on Yonge Street, on Avenue Road, on major arterials for cars, like this isn't taking bike lane space always. But is there a way of us having a sliding scale? Then, if they add a month here and there, can we charge an astronomical rate for not meeting their original commitments? Is there anything stopping us from doing that? Should be an easy answer.
So through the chair, there are 2 parts to that. So the first part is that our street occupancy permit fees are charged on a monthly basis. So the longer a developer or someone else occupies the highway, the greater the fee they will charge. We are only legally allowed to charge what would be the market, what is the prevailing market rate in the city for the right-of-way occupation. So that was determined to be the level that TPA charged for parking on street. So that's the rate at which we charge.
What is it that tells us we can only charge the legal market rate?
So through you, Chair, so that's the advice that we've had from City Legal.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Carroll.
Yes. We had our deputation nights, and as you can imagine, permit users made deputations regarding the fee increase. And I had some sympathy for the deputation this year, whereas ordinarily I don't. They made 2 complaints. One, that the 3.07% came as a surprise. GTHL, for instance, was anticipating 2.5%, and that actually is our property tax increase. So they were surprised to find that they were at a higher rate. And I know you answered the question that there are some different economic indicators that major inflation somewhat higher. But they asked that the additional 1% be staggered, and I believe it is. The 4.07% doesn't kick in at January 1st, does it?
Through the chair, that's correct. It kicks in April. So the 3.07 is implemented in January, and the additional 1% would be implemented after the approval of the budget for April.
Right. And would that be communicated to the users clearly that yes? The reason I asked this question is because that was the strategy that they were suggesting. That, you know, we get inflation, we're used to it, you've been adding inflation every year, but the over and above inflation in our move to cost recovery with those permit users, their financial year, because of the way registration work, really is about April 1st. But they don't seem to know that over and above inflation increases, that is the way we're applying them.
So through the chair, we're happy to communicate directly with that group. But you should note that the inflationary increase for parks, forestry, and recreation has changed over time. It hasn't always been just the inflationary increase, right? So we do this type of analysis every year, and there are a few years, 2014, we had a 6% increase, 2016, a 4% increase. So we do it based on the types of reviews we do around other user fees. And we're happy to have those conversations with the Greater Toronto Hockey League and others around where the implementation of those fees would start, which would be for fall, really, when it comes to the major ice users in our facilities.
And in those past years, that 6% year is a good example. The premium over and above inflation, that generally is only applied after we adopt our budget. Am I right?
That's correct. So if
I didn't realize that till after I was speaking to him.
So as an example, in 2014, the council approved increase was 3.75% on fees, on our basket rate of fees, and we had a 6% increase. 2015, it was 2.25 and 2.25. 2016, it was 2% and then an additional 2% on top of that. So there is some fluctuation in that. It is not the only time that we've done this approach around fee adjustments.
So I didn't realize till I got in the car and I thought, wait a second there, mister. What he was suggesting is in fact how we apply the premium over and above inflation, and has been for a few years now. So it's possible there's a leadership change, because they're one of our major permit users.
We have many discussions with the Greater Toronto Hockey League, and we'd also be happy to share with them the interjurisdictional analysis we've done of those similar rates, which very, very clearly speak to the place that the Toronto user rates for ice in particular fit within that spectrum, which is completely within the market rate of others around us.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
So just before we move to the next, if I may just clarify for councillors that as per the user fee policy, the inflationary increases are delegated or automatic, delegated to staff. But anything above inflation, where there's a market rate adjustment, a new fee, that is subject to the budget process, and so they would never begin prior to approval of the budget process. That's regular practice. Having said that, page 5, briefing note number 2 was another corporate briefing note we distributed. It too has been a longstanding practice to consolidate from all the budget notes all the contributions to and withdrawals from reserve and reserve funds that are being used both in the operating and the capital side. So that's here before you. It just summarizes based on for the operating side what we know is coming out of the are going into the reserves, what anticipated contributions may happen if they're budgeted annually. If they're not, we don't, there are certain assumptions. And then on the 10-year capital plan perspective as well. So they're both corporate and program-specific reserves.
Okay, seeing no questions.
Moving forward, the third briefing note, page 6, was a request at budget launch that we include in a briefing note those new and enhanced service requests that have not been included into the 2019 staff recommended operating budget. And so these have been provided. They're also identified in each of the sets of notes where there is an appropriate amount or appropriate item to identify. These are items that have been either referred or to be considered with the budget process. When we launched the budget, we said given our fiscal constraints, our priority was A, to preserve current service levels, and where we had some funding capacity to first try to advance council-approved strategies and plans that are underway, look at where things could be fully funded by third parties, or invest in initiatives that help transform, modernize, or innovate city services with benefits. So if you turn to page 7, in total that's worth about $6.9 million gross, $6 million net for those items that have been referred to the budget process. But most of them really come from board recommendations that have just been made in this cycle that we have not included in the staff recommended budget.
Questions? Councillor Carroll?
Just a quick question, because it's here on this list, and I'm now realizing, I think I understand why there's been this confusion. The issue of having litter picked up in ravines is not just, it's not just enhanced, it's new. Am I right? We don't have this program?
That's correct.
Through the chair, that's correct. We don't have a proactive program around litter pickup in ravines. We have a reactive program to various things that occur, like dumping and other things, where we'll proceed to deal with those issues, but we don't have an ongoing program in the ravines looking at litter picking.
So, in conversation in my community, people jumped at this. Yes, you can't cut that. I think it feels like a cut to them because the problem has grown. And I'm not in an urban ravine where large communities of people are living. The problem of litter has grown down there, and I'm wondering if there's a correlation between shortchanging ravine maintenance leads to now the litter's starting to accumulate, and now they're looking for an operating program to cover this off.
So through the chair, you're correct. Both the usage of the ravines and with the increased usage of the ravines, there is increased litter in the ravines as well, and we're hearing that from our stakeholders. We're talking about thousands of hectares of ravine system. So the program, we don't have a proactive program of ongoing maintenance within the ravine system. And unlike other parks where we have a maintenance program in a park and litter pickup is part of that, we don't have the ongoing presence in the ravine system to respond to it. So this is an enhanced, this would be looking at a new service level around ravine maintenance.
Right. And so, you know, if council does want to look at this, it's costed here 6.8 people coming in at 655,000 and all their equipment, et cetera, and startup costs. I can assume that what this is simply increasing seasonal staff. This would be a seasonal program, and we're looking at unbenefited part-time people just doing this work?
Through the chair, that's correct. And it's also presented as a pilot program to be able to assess, you know, what the actual amount of litter is in the ravine. So it would be 4 crews of seasonal staff with the appropriate equipment that would go in and address the issues that they find.
So if, once council balances the budget, we're still not balanced yet, the budget overall for the city is not balanced, but if council during executive committee should balance the budget and they want to add some things, they could work with staff to maybe scope this pilot such that they could afford adding in at least something and getting started, and because that's the structure of it, that it's part-time, it's possible that we could grow it over time.
The program can be grown or reduced to whatever extent council would want us to consider. It could be 1 crew in the first year that's assessed, followed, you know, by an assessment at the end of that program, you know, around what the long-term need is.
Right.
Certainly, we're willing to work in any scope to advance this.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, we can go on to the next.
Okay. So on page 7, the next briefing note, number 4, is entitled Equity Impacts of Changes in the 19 Operating Budgets. So this is now our 3rd year as we have been implementing in a phased approach equity responsive budgeting at the City of Toronto. So this briefing note comes with a summary of you know, providing a bit of overview of what equity budgeting is, the process that's been taken place. It summarizes the impact analysis that was done with a focus on looking at things that are being changed from the base budget and some feedback from the external review panel that convened to contribute to this analysis.
Questions? Oh, Councillor Wong-Tam.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you. With respect to the understanding of what an equity responsive budget would look like, there will have to be some tools that will be developed so staff can evaluate their budget in its current form and the impacts those budget decisions and recommendations will make as it relates to different groups of people that will be receiving that program or service. What does that tool look like right now at the City of Toronto, and how do staff use it?
Through the chair, the tool that's used in the equity-based budgeting review is attached to the briefing note. It's working from an equity lens tool that colleagues in the city manager's office have put together. I would agree with your opening comment, I think, that we have much more work to do in deepening the understanding throughout the organization of what equity-seeking groups are, the kinds of considerations staff need to have in determining impacts.
And is this an electronic digital tool? Is there adequate training for staff to understand how to use it? Is there a mechanism evaluating that it's been implemented or used properly so that an equity lens is incorporated over those numbers? What is the mechanism, the implementation, what does that look like?
So all of that work is ongoing, the ongoing review. Staff from financial planning, equity, diversity, and human rights and social development lead that process in the corporation. There is ongoing training, additional training, and the ultimate accountability is certainly through the comments from the external review panel, who pointed out a number of shortcomings in the process and made a number of recommendations on how to deepen it.
And so I recognize that at the beginning of this, the introduction of this budget note, that there was language saying that this is the City of Toronto's third equity responsive budget. And so, but what I'm hearing from you is that it's still a tool that's in deep development, that there probably is not as much understanding around it. The external expert review panel has said there are some shortcomings that need to be addressed. So before us today, do we truly have a budget that has had the full utilization of an equity lens, including the intersectional gender impacts?
So the process has not fully matured. When we initiated the work 3 years ago, we indicated that it would be a process of developing. I should add that it's not as if this is a well-understood practice. We are learning and creating some of the approaches we go through. I would agree with you. We have not applied it to base budget. We have not applied it to the capital budget. We need to begin to move in those directions and ensure that there is an equity lens placed on the entire city budget. We are working towards that.
Would it be easier for the divisions to perhaps showcase some of the big thought leaders and champions who really want to embrace equity responsive budgeting, gender responsive budgeting? Would it be easier to break it off to showcase the division work as opposed to asking all the divisions? Because this has now been 3 years, and I know that the team is working very hard, but it's perhaps too big to ask for that systematic structural change when there is already a lack of understanding of the benefits of the equity lens. And not to mention, the city doesn't have a fully developed tested tool that has shown that it can work and give us the outcomes that we're looking for. And perhaps we can start with PFR or perhaps city planning.
Through the chair, we're happy to take a look at perhaps in next year's application, identifying a number of city divisions to work more intensely with for the 2020 budget review process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Perks.
Thank you. To continue with what Councillor Wong-Tam was asking about, I looked at a number of the analyst notes, and some of them had a statement saying this budget has no impact on equity. And it occurred to me that that actually is probably a bad thing. Shouldn't the task be in an inequitable society that each of the budgets gets reviewed to see what it does to make our society more equitable?
Through the chair, on page 4 of the briefing note, we have a summary table, and particularly with respect to new or enhanced Investments, ideally, you would want to see the majority of those investments, if not all of them, resulting in a positive effect on equity. That would be the ultimate impact of the tool.
Right. But I'm just thinking about, and I understand the answer that you gave Councillor Wong Tam about our review being principally focused around new and enhanced. I just found it puzzling that we would be introducing any programs while we're doing an equity-based budget review where neutral would be treated as neutral. Shouldn't the task be that when we're implementing city services, that we're increasing the equity in the City of Toronto?
Through the chair, I believe that's a policy discussion for council. The task of staff was to analyze against it through a process with clear measures and criteria what the impact of budget proposals are.
So if we wanted to tailor public services in such a way that they increase social equity in the City of Toronto and have the equity-based budgeting review be part of that, you would need further direction from council.
Through the chair, yes. And as we look at the new and enhanced, and if you look at the split between those changes that have a positive impact on equity and those that are neutral, we've set no targets.
Right.
We've simply identified what the split is. As we mature the work over years, there may be an opportunity to look at setting targets in that regard.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? I'll take it into committee. Councillor Layton.
Yes, thank you very much. Just on page, I don't think it says the page number, attachment D. Why would it say under long-term care homes and services that consolidating and streamlined operations would have a negative impact?
Through the chair, sorry, Councillor. In the body of the briefing note, there is some narrative specific to...
I'm sorry, I didn't see that, so I'll read those in more detail.
I believe it had to do with potential labor impacts and availability of staff to provide support.
To serve the clients in a long-term care home.
Correct.
The same for transformation and modernization of model of care, restructuring of administrative support. This is about a potential decrease in the level of service to seniors in long-term care homes.
That's correct.
On the TTC, this is the next page, the 10-cent fare increase. It doesn't break down the fare increase as well. Do you know why? Did we not include it as a subset to the increase to the fare pass?
Sorry, Councillor, I don't.
So it strikes me that might have a greater equity impact because it targets specifically low income, the lowest of low income individuals. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. It's just before 12:30, so we will recess till 1:30.